Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. Good afternoon and welcome. I am April Johnson, Director of Community Engagement and Giving here at Housing for New Hope. And we'd like to thank you for joining us for another Coffee and Conversation event. Our Coffee and Conversation is our time to engage with you, members of our community, and discuss the issues surrounding homelessness and affordable housing and potential strategies and policies that can help us alleviate these issues. If you are new in the audience and not sure of who we are, Housing for New Hope is a nonprofit organization that focuses on connecting unhoused individuals and families to housing and hope through our programs. Our main programs include a street outreach team, housing location and navigation, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and affordable housing. Our mission is to end homelessness one valuable person at a time. So today, our guest speaker is Brian Goldstone. He'll be talking to Russ Pierce, our Executive Director at Housing for New Hope. And a little bit about Mr. Brian Goldstone. He is a journalist, anthropologist, and 2021 National Fellow at New America. He is currently writing a book, The New American Homeless, about the crisis of housing insecurity in American cities today, and the dramatic rise of the working homeless. The book will be published by Crown. His long-form reporting and essays have appeared in Harper's, The New Republic, the California Sun magazine, Journica, Jacobin, and Public Books. Brian is the director of In the Press, a journalism and public humanities initiative at Duke University's Franklin Humanities Institute. He received his PhD in anthropology from Duke in 2012. And now a little bit about Russ. He's a North Carolina native who has lived and served in 7 states and the United Kingdom. Russ became executive director of Housing for New Hope in 2019. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Wake Forest University, a Master of Divinity degree from Duke University, and a Master of Nonprofit Administration from the University of Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business. He was previously an executive with Church World Service, the Church Relief Development and Refugee Services Agency, including serving as national head of the Crop Hunger Walks. He also served as an executive with the United Methodist Church's Mission Relief and Development Agency, Global Ministries, UMCOR. Thank you both for joining us today, and we look forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, April. And I've got to remember, it's time for me to cut that intro back. I don't think we need that much about Russ, because the joy of the day is to be here with you, Brian, and really hear about your experience and your insights. One of the things I want to share as we get started, maybe of great interest to you, is that Housing for New Hope actually led, and I know we'll kind of dig into the count as we talk today, but we led that for our community last Wednesday night and had an absolutely overwhelming response from the community. We had more than double the normal number of volunteers. We had over 130 volunteers, and we had to cut off recruitment. Wow. I think a number of, it was amazing. I mean, just amazing. And I think it partially speaks to people are seeing the challenges that we're having here in Durham. We continue, as with many communities, we have skyrocketing rental rates. Many times we're in the top 3, 4, 5 cities in the country, depending on 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, those kind of things. We're seeing the loss of a lot of affordable housing, especially the naturally occurring affordable housing. And so people are really searching for ways to respond. So we have a lot of folks on the call today who were there with us Wednesday night and starting to think through, okay, so what else can we do to move forward? So I think I share that as a good context and a welcome to the folks that are joining us today, especially those who are with us on a cold, rainy, very rainy Wednesday night. So Brian, let me ask just a little bit as we get started today. What brought you to reporting on homelessness? Was there a statistic you saw or an experience that really kind of led you into this space and this research?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's so nice to be with you. I wish I could be there in Durham in person. That would have felt like a homecoming for me, having spent some of the best years of my life in that area. But I will settle for the virtual conversation. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, as far as what first brought me to report on homelessness, I think like many people living in cities in America today, homelessness has been, or at least seemed to be, this kind of inescapable part of the urban landscape. And as an anthropologist who sort of transitioned into being more of a journalist full-time and as a job, as a profession, one of the benefits of that was being able to write about things that that I was going to say that I care about, but not only care about, but want to educate myself on. I think, like many people, I have witnessed homelessness. I have talked to unhoused people over the years, but my understanding of why homelessness persists, why it seems to be growing in many places exponentially, what its causes are, what the solutions are, and so forth, was totally rudimentary. So what sort of the main impetus for me to actually pitch a story to the New Republic magazine about homelessness, the impetus for me was that my wife actually worked for many years at a community health center here in Atlanta called Mercy Care. Actually, in Durham, she also worked at Lincoln Center. So
Okay.
yeah, so Mercy Care is very similar to Lincoln Center, and she was working in an HIV clinic, and something that she mentioned to me one day that I just found completely striking was that a number of her patients were talking to her about how they were, working these jobs at Walmart, at McDonald's, not necessarily full-time jobs, because they weren't able to get the hours that would make it a full-time job, and the health benefits and so forth, the sick leave that would come with a full-time position. But they were working sort of they were cobbling together these part-time jobs, and they were still struggling to put a roof over their head. And she talked about how a number of these patients, you would never guess by looking at them that they were struggling to maintain housing. And it was kind of that initial perplexity that led me to want to investigate not just kind of the homelessness that we see around us that's conspicuous, which is important enough to address, but also what I came to realize is kind of this hidden homeless population of people who are part of the labor force. They don't have the visible markers or manifestations of what we tend to associate with homelessness, and yet they are homeless nonetheless. So that was kind of the initial impetus that led me to kind of do a deep dive into these issues.
Were there some early, you shared in both articles, you focus in on a particular family, and that really, I think, brings a richness to this storytelling and reporting. I'm curious, either those families, or were there other families that when you really got to talk to them, it really just brought this in a new way, the need before you?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it was a very, very long process of reporting that story for New Republic. That was the first piece I wrote about housing insecurity and homelessness. I talked to probably dozens of families and individuals. Did a lot of kind of what is called pre-reporting at homeless shelters with service providers, and there were a number of themes that that began to emerge across these conversations. And I think when I finally met Ms. Goodman and her family, who I ended up writing about, a lot of those themes sort of coalesced in this one family story. And I think what was so stunning to me about what Ms. Goodman shared was that, first of all, the initial trigger into homelessness for her and her family was the very ordinary and banal and unexceptional fact of that she was renting a single family home here in Atlanta, and it was kind of in a historically Black neighborhood that was kind of up and coming, as realtors like to say, or hot, as realtors like to say. And she never missed a rent payment. She was kind of an ideal tenant in many ways. And yet when it came time to renew her lease, she was told that the landlord would not be renewing. And she was working full-time as a home health aide. And it was that initial trigger of, you cannot live in this home anymore, even though you've done nothing to violate the lease. You simply can't live in this home anymore because this home has become more valuable to sell the home for me as an investor than it is to continue to rent to you. And so that just was the first domino that fell. And several months later, by the time I met this family, they were living in just abysmal conditions, having floated around different extended stay hotels and relatives, trying to get into shelters, but couldn't because Ms. Goodman had a teenage son, and she didn't want to split up the family. So I think it was just that whole story, the ways that gentrification and housing speculation had fueled this family's experience with insecurity, how just the fact that she was working full time, which was kind of a rebuttal to the stereotypes that I think I myself even had about unhoused people. So many aspects of her story kind of seemed like they deserved separate books or analyses unto themselves. Yeah.
Well, and I found it so interesting, because I actually lived in Atlanta, in the Atlanta area, from 2017 to 2019.
Oh, okay.
And actually had an office on Ponce de Leon. I could look out the window and see Ponce City Market. At least right across the street from our offices was one of the fastest gentrifying communities in the country. And so we had less and less staff. I lived all the way out in Gwinnett County. And it was so fascinating. Fascinating is not quite the word, I guess, maybe disturbing, but because it just became so clear. It was sort of like all the outer suburb folks who'd been in outer suburbs suddenly decided they wanted to live in town. Their stores came with them, their restaurants came with them, and the amount of displacement was just incredible.
Absolutely.
And so I felt like her story really was so illustrative of this piece of, you have these long-term stable communities where there's naturally occurring affordable housing, and then suddenly a new group comes in, decides they want that, and you've got gentrification and displacement. And it's so interesting because that's, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen that increase so much here in Durham. And we actually see it as an agency where we have long-term partners who've, worked with our clients that are in supportive housing, sometimes 6, 7, 8, 10 years. And everything's happening. The houses are being sold, and the folks who buy them, sometimes they're tear downs and replacements, but oftentimes somebody buys them and just wants to live in them. After them having been rentals for 30 and 40 years.
Yeah. If I could just add one thing to, I imagine this is the case in Durham as well. Something that was so heart-wrenching to see with this family was that, and I actually ended the magazine story with this scene. It was this moment where Ms. Goodman, she was so excited to show me this development, this kind of mixed use retail entertainment dining complex that had opened up just down the block from her, which the Beltline, I'm sure you're familiar with the Beltline, which the Beltline was running near. And the property values in this area had just skyrocketed. And in any case, she was so excited to show me this retail and dining complex. It looks like many places in Durham, very hip, very sexy, kind of this urban rustic feel, post-industrial feel. And then she stopped and she realized this was not her neighborhood anymore. This place that she was so excited about was not hers anymore, even though she had grown up just a few blocks away from there. And I think the kind of profound insight for me in that moment was that that many of the people I'm writing about, that I'm writing about now in this book, which is centered on 5 different families, is that they want to enjoy the benefits, the amenities of the new Atlanta or the new Durham or the new Austin or the new Nashville or wherever we happen to be talking about. They want to enjoy the new schools or the improved schools. They want to enjoy in what were formerly food deserts. They want to enjoy the new restaurants and supermarkets. And I think it's that reality of just being shoved out of that and realizing that that they are the casualties of the success, the new success of these cities. They're the victims of this newfound development and prosperity.
Mm-hmm. I remember walking down Ponce, and there was an old Kroger there for a long time that was not cared for well, I think was how some would have put it. And I was walking with somebody who'd lived in the neighborhood for a long time, and they said, we wanted this replaced for years. There were a lot of issues with it. And the person said they finally replaced it, but it's not meant for me.
Yeah.
It's in the bottom of like I can't remember, 10, 12-story building, and probably the fanciest Kroger around. And so it's just an interesting piece. And then obviously with this displacement, and I feel like your story and Salinas help illustrate some of this. I mean, certainly what I felt like we were seeing in Atlanta was the places that people could afford to live were further and further out. And yet certainly Atlanta's very serious issues. We face this in Durham, that there's not a lot of good public transit. I mean, even with the MARTA stops at the couple of the county line.
Absolutely.
And that's where folks are ending up. That's one of the few places they can go, but then it's such a trip back into work.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, it drives me crazy when I talk to folks about this and they say, well, why don't they just move somewhere else? And my two responses to that are, first of all, why should they? This is their home. This is their city. This city belongs to them as much as it does, if not more, to those of us who are recent transplants. And so why should they need to move elsewhere? They have family networks here. They have schools here. But second, my response is, where do they go? We now know through studies from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and other researchers that there is not a single county in the United States where someone working a minimum wage job can afford a median priced apartment. So this idea that there's just, especially near these newly prosperous cities, the idea that there's just this affordable, quote, workforce housing that is easily accessible to the city and so forth is just, it's a story that I think we tell ourselves to justify the transformation that we're allowing in our cities.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you say that, because I feel like 4 or 5 years ago, I was hearing more in Atlanta, maybe Chicago a little bit, that as there was rampant gentrification in the inner city areas in the downtown, that the inner ring suburbs were suddenly becoming more available. But even that has gone away.
Yeah, I mean, the affordability, certainly in the northern suburbs, Sandy Springs, Marietta, cities and towns in Cobb County and northern Fulton County, absolutely. I mean, they're in many cases experiencing the same thing that neighborhoods around the Beltline and sort of the urban core in Atlanta have been seeing, as far as just outrageous rents and a total lack of affordability. But there are a number of kind of suburban areas in other parts of the metro area which are slightly more affordable, but they, I've come to think of these areas as kind of refuse spaces. They're spaces where those who lived in Atlanta proper, in the city of Atlanta, whose lives and livelihoods are in the city, they've been kind of dumped into these peripheries, these suburban peripheries that have no services, have very little transit, that are dangerous, that they're basically places where these working families can be kind of out of sight, out of mind. I mean, it really, and a lot of these suburban areas, they're not what we think of when we think of the suburbs. They're really desolate in many ways, and that is by design. They too have been sites of profound disinvestment, and a lot of these areas contain some of the most dangerous and degraded apartment communities in the metro area. So that's absolutely right. I mean, there are suburban areas in Atlanta that those I'm following, writing about, have been forced to move, but without any of the kind of services and features that we positively associate with the suburbs.
Mm-hmm. Well, and, going back a moment to, you talked about the experience of eviction, which in many ways becomes a tool of some of this gentrification that's happening. I'm just curious where, Durham as a community has pretty consistently has the highest, if not one of the highest, eviction rates in the state of North Carolina. And, certainly, after the eviction moratorium ended, we saw it increase dramatically here. Because while the moratorium was in place, we were seeing these skyrocketing rents and different pieces happening. And so many landlords had other options, right? I don't know if there's a better way to put that, but I mean, they were choosing other options. And I'm just curious, what we find, we work with a lot of folks who are maybe coming recently into homelessness, working with rapid rehousing, they get connected to housing. And those evictions can be hugely detrimental when people are trying to get back into housing. Having arrears can be hugely detrimental. I mean, we had a program with some funding from Blue Cross Blue Shield a couple of years ago where, we were able to pay off arrears for folks, and it made a huge difference. Huge difference, but not every community has those kind of resources. I'm just curious, in your work, particularly the impact of eviction on folks who are in this place in their housing. What are you seeing that we should learn from, that we should think about in terms of working through the eviction situation?
Yeah. Well, so much of what you just said is absolutely, I found that to absolutely be the case in my own reporting. And, a kind of one way of responding to that question of the place of evictions in homelessness and housing insecurity is to say that, rightly so, a lot of the conversation around homelessness in America over the last decade or so has revolved around solutions to, ending homelessness, getting people off the street through housing first and low barrier shelters and so forth. But what you're bringing up is the necessity to look at what causes homelessness to begin with. We can't just focus on trying to provide shelter, whether that's temporary or permanent shelter housing, to people already experiencing homelessness. We're seeing this in places like LA or San Francisco, where for every, let's say, 100 units of housing that become available for unhoused men and women, another 300-400 people are becoming homeless. So we have to really be asking, how do we how do we turn off that faucet of that's creating this influx of homelessness? And a major way of addressing that is trying to keep people in the homes they already occupy. And I have come to believe over the last 3 years of researching and writing about these issues that that tenant rights have to be a central part of our conversation about homelessness in America. The imbalance of landlord versus tenant rights and access to legal counsel, access to resources, just having the knowledge of what am I legally entitled to as a tenant is really dramatic. And so I think that any measures that we can implement to make evictions less likely, less frequent, whether right to counsel programs that we've seen have incredible results in places like New York City that have drastically reduced the eviction rates. Just having a lawyer in your corner can drastically reduce the number of evictions that we see in our cities. And also tenant organizing has been crucial in many places. Seeing my inability to remain housed, my inability to keep a roof over my head, not just as this personal failing, but in the same way that people who have extreme student debt or medical debt have come to really recognize themselves as victims of particular policies and political ideologies, and are working to fight against that. I think we're seeing something similar in the realm of housing, and I think that all of that is necessary and more to stem that tide of those becoming homeless.
I think it's such a good point. And I think one of the things that Durham as a city really prides itself on is there's significant investment in legal aid infrastructure here. Mm-hmm. And so, and I've talked to, I'll say opposing counsel in some of those moments who said, if we go into the nearby counties, we don't deal with this way. In mm-hmm. terms of the level of support for tenants when they're going through the process. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a real point of pride. The interesting piece for us has been, I think, as a community, many communities had, emergency rental assistance programs during COVID, after COVID. And as that started to wear off, that funding started to run out, there were more and more people who were facing eviction. Yeah. And one of the things that we're seeing increasingly here, and, we also have own and operate our own properties. And one of the things we are seeing is folks who haven't been able to pay for extended periods, that where you used to be able to provide notice and they would find another option, there literally are no options. And so I haven't seen the data yet, but I'm continuing to be interested in how many people are going through appeal in a way that they wouldn't 3 or 4 years ago, simply because there is nothing else to go to. Yeah. It's not that there's another housing option. It is, homelessness is the next option.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just one issue that has gotten a lot of attention, at least here in the South, over the last year or so, is the upsurge of institutional investors, coming into our cities and suburbs and buying up housing en masse and turning that into rental housing, sometimes sitting on it. But something that was really interesting to discover was, one of the reasons why a lot of that activity with outside investors coming in has been so prevalent in the South, in cities like Atlanta. I think in the Triangle, that's also been pretty prevalent, is because states like Georgia and North Carolina and Florida have incredibly weak tenant rights, and we've seen the CEOs of some of these private equity firms say, yeah, we need to target our activity in these places where, put simply, it's easier to evict folks, where we don't have the legal hurdles that we have in California or New York. And so that should tell us that, you know, if we're interested in housing stability, if we believe that housing is a fundamental right, not just, you know, a privilege that that only, you know, the most affluent among us can afford, but that housing is no less a fundamental right than education or safe drinking water, then we need to treat it that way. And we need to, our you know, alarms should be going off when we hear people with vast amounts of money and capital saying, let's really target our activities in places where tenant rights are weak. Yeah, that should just be an alert that we need to work on ameliorating that imbalance.
It's such an interesting factor to think about, because we are seeing, especially when I'm talking to some of our nonprofit affordable housing developers that are, you know, have many units in North Carolina, they're surprised by the number of outside groups that work with affordable housing even that are coming in and trying to buy pieces. I mean, we've seen some of that in Durham, and it's so interesting because, you know, these issues we run into with, you have to have three times the income, your income needs to be 3 times the rent in order to qualify. And we've had some properties that have been around 25, 30 years where, you know, the local owners, you know, and talking properties like 100 or more units, knew to look past, like if there was steady income and they were at 2.6%, 2.6 times, it would work with that.
Yeah.
And as soon as new groups came in from outside, it was like, nope, the rule is 3.
Yeah.
Beginning, end of story. And so we started having seniors just displaced out of housing they'd been in for many years. And one of the things I look at and wonder about, you know, we have a lot of challenge at times getting folks connected to new housing opportunities in the community, depending on their housing barriers. If it's, obviously we've talked about eviction, folks who have justice involvement in the past. And, you know, we see situations where people can't afford it. They're out, they have been out of the justice system for more than 10 years. They're stably employed, everything, and they're still running into those pieces. And I keep thinking, like, there's something we're going to have to figure out how to crack around risk management offices that many of the corporations have. And I can't even quite, I don't know if you've run into that. I'm probably diverting a little bit from some of what you've written on, but it keeps coming back to me. I'm like, how do we break through these risk management offices and figure out what their algorithms are?
Absolutely. No, I mean, this is not a detour at all from what we're talking about. In fact, I think that the minutia of what's involved and what's demanded of families and individuals to secure housing in America has to be more part of our national discussion, and the journalism and reporting on these issues should be covering, for instance, how it is that a 3-digit number, our credit score, has come to determine whether or not you have a roof over your head in many cases. If you have medical debt, student debt, credit card debt, that can make the difference of whether you and your children have safe and secure housing. I think another thing I've run into a lot are application fees and these administrative fees that, especially in hot markets where landlords can, where it is a landlord's market, and they can basically, they know how competitive it is. They know how desperate folks are for permanent shelter. And so what I've seen a lot in following families trying to secure housing is we're going to charge you an $85 application fee that's non-refundable and $125 non-refundable administrative fee just to apply for an apartment that may or may not even be available. So I mean, this should be criminal. It literally, you know, and in some states, it has been made illegal to just charge what it's price gouging, you know. And just to make one point that comes to mind on this topic is, you know, during the pandemic, especially early on, there was so much outrage, justifiably, people, hoarding masks and hand sanitizer and trying to sell it, for hundreds of dollars on eBay and Amazon. And, there were some really sensational kind of moments of sheriff's deputies storming into these kind of spaces and confiscating this stuff because it was just price gouging. And yet that's exactly what we've allowed housing to become in this country. We have taken this precious necessity, this absolute essential thing that we need, and allowed it to go to the highest bidder. And there, we had a history of public housing in this country, which we can also talk about, and which was in many ways a failure, partly because of how the degree of disinvestment that went along with it. But we are allowing this absolute necessity to be hoarded, to be auctioned off, to have, even just to apply for it, the kinds of predatory and exploitative practices that we just don't even blink at anymore because they seem so normal and everyday. That's where I think a lot of our conversation needs to be, if we're talking about addressing the housing crisis, not just building more units, which of course we also need, but it also has to be the exploitative and predatory practices that we have allowed to just kind of run free with and unchecked for many years now.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the characterization of basically the control of the housing market in that way as a form of hoarding. I've not thought about it that way, but it really is concentrating in such a way that it does have that feel, and that's just fascinating. And I think when we talk about the exploitative piece around housing, I mean, it obviously brings us back, and somebody was asking a question online around, could you touch a little bit about the connection between living wages, education, and homelessness? Because in your articles, I mean, you talk about the number of communities where you'd have to have multiple full-time jobs in order to afford housing, and just that, I feel like even during the pandemic, we had this brief moment of saying, there are folks who have, very critical jobs and we should be taking better care of them. And then kind of as it tapered off, it feels like that conversation stopped.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we as a country have needed to tell ourselves a story about homelessness to make it less scandalous. And that story has taken different forms, but it usually consists of some version of people are homeless because of they've been struck with mental illness. It's something that we can't really control, that they couldn't control, and it's tragic. Or that story has taken a more kind of denunciatory or pathologizing form of people are homeless because they're lazy. They don't work hard enough. They want a handout. They want to be outside, whatever. And to really confront the number of families and individuals who are experiencing extreme housing insecurity and indeed homelessness, even though they are working their ass. I mean, just to put it crudely, the people that I'm following in I've never witnessed people working so hard. And I don't mean to draw kind of a moral distinction between, the worthy and unworthy poor, or the deserving and undeserving poor, and make that about whether or not people are working or not. Because we also should point out that work for a number of people that I'm writing about takes the form of not necessarily wage labor, but domestic work, taking care of disabled children or relatives, engaged in forms of labor that are not recognized by the census as being part of the labor force. And that is work too. That is not laziness. But I think that we as a country have needed to hold on very strongly to these stories in order to maintain the status quo. And at best, when the majority of people in this country get involved in trying to address homelessness, or around Christmas, donating their time and energy, that tends to be thought of as a form of charity. And to really address homelessness in America, what is needed is not charity, but justice. Charity is not what is called for when someone loses their home because that home was an investment vehicle for someone who has multiple properties, and they are using that home to bolster their future and their financial security. When someone loses their home because of that, that is not what's needed. Is not charity. What's needed is justice. What's needed is a set of policies and a political paradigm that says that person who is losing their home for that reason deserves housing as much as anyone else. So I feel like some of these fundamental sort of paradigms about housing and homelessness need to change before we can even, I'm a full believer in implementing practical solutions to homelessness. But I think that some of the bedrock ideologies and assumptions really have to be transformed before we'll truly see an end to this tragedy.
Yeah. How do you, you touch on in your pieces the challenges around pit counts, and for folks who are listening who may not be aware of pit counts. So every year HUD mandates a point in time count, fourth Wednesday of the month in January, because it's one of the coldest night of the years, with the idea that if you are not housed on one of the coldest nights of the year, you're truly somebody who doesn't have resources or connection, family, friends that would take you in. So that's the theory behind it. And we just, as I said, in the community, had our count last week. You point out, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the people that were really missing, like even in a well-run pit count, which I think we had last week. We're very proud of it, and maybe a little exhausted from it, but it was terrific. But there's still groups that we're really missing, and I'm curious you to talk about the groups we're missing, and when we're not aware of them, what in the larger picture are we missing? Sure.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that question really is in many ways at the heart of the work that I'm doing around these issues. The point in time count is incredibly important, but it has to be seen for what it is, what it's intended to be, which is a very particular snapshot of a very particular and narrowly defined subpopulation of people experiencing homelessness in America. The point in time count excludes intentionally and by definition families who are doubled up with others. You could have just left a homeless shelter because your time there ran to an end, it expired, and been forced to move into an extended stay hotel that maybe where the conditions could be much worse than even at that shelter, but you are not counted as homeless once you move from the shelter to that hotel or to your relative's couch. And so the point in time count is fine for the snapshot that it's meant to be, but where I think it becomes kind of egregious is when those point in time counts then are taken up, presented by often political leaders in our cities, given to the media, and the media broadcast these headlines like, based on the point in time count, homelessness is down 18% this year. And that creates a sense that just because who we're finding when we go out on that one night in January and go out in the street and look under bridges and into abandoned spaces, that encompasses homelessness in America, and it simply doesn't. And the opposite is actually true, where if you look at, for instance, the Department of Education, which is another kind of domain of the federal government. HUD is who oversees the point in time count. The Department of Education, they have their own definition of homelessness, their own kind of census around homelessness. And in many cities, just as the official point in time count numbers have been going down over the years, the Department of Education numbers that are only counting students, not even their parents or unschooled siblings, but just the children themselves, those numbers are far, far, far outpacing the point in time count numbers because their definition is a little wider, and it does include those in hotels and staying with others, doubled up with others. So we need it all. We need a much more comprehensive and full picture of homelessness. And my fear with the point in time count is that in many cities, including Atlanta, when the PIT numbers are made available, that becomes part of a public narrative about the decline of homelessness. And of course, we can understand the appeal why the mayor of Atlanta would want to broadcast this supposed tackling of homelessness as evidenced through these lower numbers. But in a city like Atlanta, just as that public narrative is homelessness is on the decline, we're actually seeing the number of those who are precariously housed and homeless by these other definitions skyrocketing. And so we just need a fuller picture and a more, I'll say, a more honest picture, and a picture that's informed more by integrity and by truly, a concern for all of those experiencing this kind of hardship, and not just those who are defined as literally homeless by HUD.
No, and it bears out so much here in Durham. I mean, in 2022, the PIT count showed 75 children that were unhoused by the HUD definition. And we actually, one thing we have seen change over the last 3 or 4 years is we are seeing families consistently, maybe 20 to 30 in the community in cars. So the process that has changed. But if we talk to the school system and look at the McKinney-Vento definition, they're saying, no, it's like 600-700 children a year that we're seeing or more. And so I think that economy, and I think we even see it in the fact that, we have some affordable housing properties that are focused on folks that are 50% AMI or less.
Yeah.
And particularly what we find is, because of the rapid rehousing work we do, supportive housing work we do with the supportive services, we are finding that folks who are at 30% AMI or less, and I may revisit that with the way the economy's been changing here lately, but at least at 30% AMI or less, they are very much in need of connections to supportive services, just as anybody who'd be in supportive housing or rapid rehousing would be.
Yeah, and just really quick on that point, not only are we missing the comprehensive picture of those experiencing homelessness in America, but ironically or perversely, those who are left out of the point in time count are also almost invariably those who are also kind of being locked out of services, even to be eligible for rapid rehousing, which tends to be more oriented toward families. Even to be eligible for rapid rehousing, you have to fit the HUD definition of literally homeless for a particular period of time, which means that you have to be either on the street, you have to be living in a car, a place not meant for human habitation, or in a shelter. But as a thought experiment, imagine if all of our shelters, let's say in Durham or in Atlanta, just closed tonight. They just shut down. According to this paradigm, we would then, those families who are in those shelters would either need to go stay on the sidewalk they would need to go stay on the sidewalk or sleep in their car to be eligible for services. But if out of their desperation, they did anything to avoid sleeping on the sidewalk, they would not be eligible for services. Being in a shelter makes you eligible for services, but being in a hotel next door to that shelter excludes you from rapid rehousing funds. So there's something kind of Kafkaesque and just maddening about and it's kind of incentivizing people. It's like, I actually had a family told by a very well-meaning and very kind service provider, like, you know what, if you go and sleep outside, we can help you, but we can't help you right now. And it's just like, are you serious?
It's when I first came 4 years ago, coordinated entry had not been set up in our community. So people would call all the different agencies, and we were smaller then, and we'd take turns answering the phone. And I honestly came up with this, once I started figuring some of this out and I was answering the calls, I developed kind of this protocol of how I'd answer. And I'd say, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then I'm probably going to say something crazy, and then we're going to unpack it. And it always came down to someone who was living with a family member, couch surfing, as we say. Like, according to the education system, that is homelessness. According to HUD, not so much. If you're staying in a hotel, if someone's paying for you, HUD says, yes, you're homeless. If you're paying for yourself, HUD says not so much. And it is this, and I get it comes out of trying to prioritize. I do get that, but it probably begs a deeper question of, how do you have more resources and pay attention to the broader group of people that really do need these resources. So I know we're getting low on time, and April's appeared, and so I want to do kind of a twist on one of the last questions that was asked here. Somebody said, what are some of the bedrock changes that need to take place? So I guess from your study and conversation with people with lived experience, like, if there were two things you'd prioritize, what would those things be from a policy perspective at the local or state level?
Well, I mean, as far as just a bedrock ideological assumption, I would just say that recognizing housing as a fundamental human right has to be the beginning of any conversation about how to address homelessness. There are an increasing number of people and policymakers, I think, saying that, and that is very encouraging. But in order to talk about specific policy changes and get into the weeds of why is this person who is paying their own way at a hotel not counted as homeless, but if an agency is paying for them, they are, that stuff is all really, really important. But at the bottom of any conversation, before we can have a serious conversation, housing has to be recognized just as a fundamental human right. And we have to shape our policies, I think, around that paradigm. And we have to, simply, I think as part of that, leaving people's destinies, people's lives to the whims of the private market is not tenable. And in many ways, it is, I'll go so far as to say it's an act of violence to abandon vast swaths of our communities and our cities, the people who make our cities possible, often through their work, to abandon them to the private market and its whims and its fluctuations, and whatever the market can get away with, the market will get away with, I think is just an act of violence. And I think that we need to start using that kind of language in talking about the persistence and, in many places, explosion of homelessness in this country. This is not just kind of an accidental or regrettable kind of feature of urban life. In many ways, this is an engineered abandonment. And so I think those are kind of the two big kind of paradigmatic shifts that I think need to be introduced into our discussions about homelessness and housing.
Absolutely. Thank you. And as we wrap up today, I just want to say thank you so much for the time and for what you shared. Am I allowed to ask when a book may be published? I know you're working on it actively.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to trigger anything by asking.
No, I am doing my best to get it done. I am, as with, the magazine articles I've written, I was incredibly blessed to have editors who were more interested in the care of detail, the care of attention, and getting it right than kind of rushing it through. And so I'm very blessed to have a book editor now who is actually saying to me, like, it's okay, slow it down. We want to get this right. We want to cover as many of these angles as we can. So that is a more, that's kind of an evasive answer, but I'm trying to get it finished by sometime this year during 2023. But writing a book is hard, and I'm following 5 different families. It's a lot. It's a lot to do justice to one family story and the complexities, but 5 families. And a lot of these families, they are continuing to experience crises all the time, and I'm trying to write, but I also care very deeply about them, and I'm often putting aside the writing to just help deal with the emergencies that are arising. So yeah, it's been an adventure, to say the least, writing this book.
Well, we really look forward to it. And honestly, I mean, I found the article so helpful, and especially the article around the new American homelessness. I thought it was one of the best explanations of the quirks of the HUD system. And quirks may not be quite the frustrations. And so I'm really looking forward to the book. I mean, I feel like, many folks who are on, we've read Evicted, we've read The Color of Law. Some of us go back long enough to remember The Two-Income Trap from Elizabeth Warren and her daughter.
Yeah.
And I really feel like it's going to take a place on the shelf and in the that'll help us understand and really start making some of this progress that we need to for our most vulnerable neighbors. So thank you again. And
yeah. And thank you for the work that you all are doing in the Triangle and in Durham. I'm sure it feels at times like you're trying to put your finger in this, plug this gushing, whatever the metaphor is, whatever that picture is, that it's an uphill battle. And organizations like yours are often working with very limited resources and making it stretch as far as you possibly can. And so I have enormous admiration for those of you on the call, in the trenches, who are doing case management, trying to just help this one family or individual get back on their feet. It's so crucial. So yeah, thank you for what you all are doing.
thank you.
Well, thank you both for joining us today. I really enjoyed the conversation. And Brian, I think we can't wait for your book to come out. So we'll be keeping in touch with you. We'll let our audience know when it's come out, because it sounds like it's going to be really good. So, and I want to thank our audience and those of you who joined us today. We will, if you came in late or if you know someone who wasn't able to make it, this video will be available on our YouTube channel so that you can go back and watch it. So I want to thank you. And yes, speaking of meager funds, not enough funds to get things done, we are working every day to assist people. And Russ had mentioned earlier about assisting people in paying arrears, rental arrears, utility arrears. So if you would like to donate to Housing for New Hope, we would love for you to donate to the Housing Assets Fund. You'll see that on the donate page, because that particular fund allows us to help people get into housing any way they need. If it's relocation expense, if it's down payment rental expenses, whatever it is to get them into housing, it helps to remove those barriers. So thank you very much. Also, I would like to announce, I meant to mention it earlier today. I usually have my coffee cup here, my Love Durham coffee cup. I do have a Housing for New Hope one too, but Love Durham. Cocoa Cinnamon, or Little Waves Coffee, is celebrating their 10th anniversary this year. And so what they wanted to do was donate $1 for to Housing for New Hope for every bag of their 10th anniversary bag called Your Head is Round, So You Change Your Mind, blend. So that will go on until the end of February. So in honor of coffee and conversation, pop by Cocoa Cinnamon Coffee Shop. Tell them that we told you to pop by and purchase their bag to assist Help Housing for New Hope. But thank you again, and see you again in another few months. Thank you again, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Brian. Thank you all.